Now, in this speech, I would like to examine Dr. Dacey's arguments on behalf of atheism to see whether they pass philosophical muster. And all 5 of his arguments share the same basic form. Step 1 is to say that if God existed, then we would expect to see blank, and you fill in the blank. Step 2 is, but we do not find blank, and therefore one concludes that God does not exist. Now, I want to make 2 general comments about this style of argumentation. First of all, it's enormously presumptuous. Basically, what Dr. Dacey is saying is that if God doesn't fulfill our expectations, then we should conclude that he doesn't exist. But who says that God has to fulfill our expectations? How can we predict with any confidence what God would do if he existed? If we find that our expectations aren't met, then isn't it the better part of discretion and humility to re-examine and perhaps revise those expectations? We're simply not in a position to dictate to God that he has to act in accordance with our expectations. Well, what about the second argument based on the success of science? Here the key premise is that if God existed, he would act in the world in ways that science must take into account. Well, again, I think that's plainly false. Miracles, by their very nature, are unpredictable and unrepeatable. But science only deals with predictable and repeatable phenomena. When science confronts an unpredictable or unrepeatable event, then it tends to just ignore it as a scientific anomaly, and thus science takes no cognizance of miracles. In fact, I would revise this premise to state, if God existed, he would create a universe operating according to certain natural laws so that it is open to rational exploration and discovery. And that guarantees the success of natural science. Well, what about the third argument based on the mind-brain connection? Again, I think both of the premises of this argument are false. For example, take the first premise. If God existed, we would have an immaterial soul that is independent of the brain. I think this is pure speculation. We have no way of knowing, apart from experience, what sort of creatures God would create if he existed. In fact, if Dr. Dacey's arguments against the possibility of mind-body interaction are correct, then it is logically impossible for there to be creatures composed of mind and body. So we could hardly expect that God would do the logically impossible. And thus, if his arguments for his second premise are correct, then the first premise is necessarily false. And so this argument is literally self-refuting. One premise refutes the other. Moreover, the second premise, that the mind or soul is entirely dependent upon the brain or the body, goes far beyond the evidence. At best, the evidence shows a correlation of mental events and brain events, but not dependency. Worse, though, this premise is self-defeating. For if the mind is entirely dependent upon the body, then causation between mind and body is a one-way street. The body can affect the mind, but the mind cannot affect the body. And that is incompatible with freedom of the will. Everything you believe is determined by the physical stimuli that you receive through your body. But then, what about Dr. Dacey's belief that his second premise is true? In that case, his belief is not the result of rational reflection or choice on his part. Rather, it's just physically determined for him. His believing it is no more rational than his having a headache. And so this premise is incapable of being rationally affirmed, and so it is literally self-defeating. Well, what about the fourth argument from evolution? This argument has real problems. Not only are the premises false, but the argument is logically invalid, so that even if both premises were true, the conclusion still wouldn't follow because the argument violates the rules of logic. To make the argument valid, you have to add an additional premise, 3. All life on Earth is the product of purely naturalistic evolution. You have to add that premise. But that premise goes far beyond the evidence, which at best supports microevolution within various natural kinds. In fact, if naturalistic evolution really is as inefficient and imperfect as Dr. Dacey claims that it is, then all the less reason we have to believe that life on Earth is the product of purely naturalistic evolution, given the incredible complexity of biological life. So this argument also tends to be self-defeating. The more evidence you have for the one premise, then the less reason you have to believe the other premise. But leaving that problem aside, why couldn't God use evolution as his means of creating life? Well, here Dr. Dacey's key premise is that if God existed, he would create living things by an efficient process. Well, I don't see any reason to think that that's true. As the philosopher Thomas Morris has pointed out, efficiency is important only for someone with limited time or limited resources or both. But God has unlimited time and unlimited resources at his disposal. For such a person, efficiency is just no big deal. So I don't have any confidence in Dr. Dacey's assumption that God would not use evolution as a means of generating biological complexity.